Today I'm at Philadelphia's Franklin Court to answer the age-old question, was Benjamin Franklin a serial killer? Now, the boring answer to this is no, there's no reason to think that he was. But you may have some follow-up questions. I'm Han Kaylee, and this is Remains to be Seen, where we explore medical history and health justice by considering the collection, use, display, and disposal of human bodies. I spent the last 5 years leading a health equity program at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Sometimes I also get to consult with medical educators or guest lecture in various classrooms across the United States. I've found that even within healthcare fields, most people are totally unaware of how the development of professional medicine in the US has shaped health knowledge and health practice today. But, at least in my opinion, it's fascinating. And it's crucial to understand as we strive to address health gaps like those we've seen in the coronavirus pandemic. So I'm visiting sites across the United States to explore the social history of the body in medical science and in related fields, to draw attention to this important and poorly understood aspect of our history. This series asks, how have human remains been conceptualized and how have they been treated? How have they been used, displayed, and disposed of for scientific purposes? And how have these practices reflected and influenced changing attitudes about the living? In this video, I'm going to discuss a number of sensitive topics, including the collection, use, and disposal of human remains, slavery, capital punishment, mass racialized and gendered violence, and the criminalization of abortion. I also briefly describe anti-Indigenous atrocities. I encourage commenters to remember that we're talking about the remains, the lives, and the deaths of real people, and to join me in a commitment to treat them and their mourners with appropriate respect. So, back to Craven Street, London, 1998. Ben Franklin's London house was being excavated to make way for the Ben Franklin Museum in London. And archaeologists found about a dozen human remains. It turned out that the remains were definitely interred there while he lived in London, and this led to a number of articles with clickbaity headlines like, was Benjamin Franklin a serial killer? A lot of these clickbait articles talk about this as Ben Franklin's house, which isn't quite accurate. Ben is renting from Margaret Stevenson, who runs it as a boarding house. He's in London starting in 1757, doing very important diplomat things that are mostly irrelevant to this story, but he's been there for nearly 16 years, except a period from 1762 to 1764, where he's back in Philadelphia, during which he built the house at Franklin Court. While in London, he becomes really close with the landlady, Margaret Stevenson, and especially with her daughter, Polly. In 1770, Polly marries William Hewson, and the pair move into kind of an in-law suite out back of Margaret Stevenson's place. Hewson is an up-and-coming hematologist. Nope, there we go. And surgeon, who's just been elected to the Royal Society of London, which is an extremely fancy science club that's been going since 1660. The big anticlimax of the Ben Franklin serial killer story is that not only did the bodies come from an anatomy school, but he didn't even run the anatomy school himself. It was Hewson's, opened shortly after his wedding in 1770. Historians at the Craven Street house say that Ben Franklin definitely knew about it, but there's no evidence either way whether he was involved directly. What is clear from the record is that Franklin would have been just fine with it. Just a few years before moving to Craven Street in 1757, Franklin established his plan for the Philadelphia Academy and Charity School and served as its first president, and he founded the closely linked Pennsylvania Hospital with Dr. Thomas Bond, who is remembered now as the father of clinical medicine. Franklin and Bond were also co-founders of the American Philosophical Society, which frequently published about medical matters and included quite a few physicians. One of these, Dr. Thomas Cadwallader, started hosting private anatomy lectures really similar to Hewson's around the time Franklin and Bond opened the hospital, and may have sourced cadavers from the hospital. You may be thinking that even if Hewson wasn't the only one with corpses in his basement, it's still very creepy, and that is a reasonable conclusion. Performing dissection or autopsy of a human body still has an element of taboo, and this taboo was even more dramatic at the time that these private anatomy schools were operating. In the contemporary US, having bodies at home is also a huge taboo, and in that detail, it was pretty different for Hewson's contemporaries. During the 18th century, it would have been typical for deceased household members to await burial at home, and for family members to interact with the corpse to prepare it for burial. Collecting remains or parts of remains with anthropological or medical significance was also increasingly common among Europeans with an interest in science. So it wouldn't have been unusual for someone like Hewson to save specimens from patients who had died in their care, or to buy specimens that they found interesting from other doctors or from collectors. These might have been used as teaching tools, displayed as curios or trophies, or something in between. In Western Europe, nonetheless, opening the body, performing dissection or autopsy, exposing the innards, had long been taboo. But Enlightenment medical thinkers were increasingly viewing the body as a machine governed by the laws of physics, hence the term physician for someone who applies a scientific approach to health. This new mechanical paradigm meant that there was increasing tolerance for opening the body within the halls of learning, but accessing cadavers was still very difficult and often illegal. There was an increasing expectation for physicians to have a deeper understanding of anatomy and to have experience operating on cadavers. But at this time, many physicians didn't go to medical school, and those medical schools that had what we would now call a cadaver lab often had BYOC policies, leaving individual students to source their own bodies. This created a huge demand for black market cadavers. So you have this cottage industry springing up of people who would get bodies somehow and charge would-be physicians for lectures, demonstrations, and the use of remains. And whether people had gone to medical school or not, they would likely supplement that training with attendance at a private anatomy school. While relatively sparse in the colonies, private anatomy schools were popping up all over London and in other large learning centers in Europe. Hewson's school was short-lived. 4 years after he started running the anatomy school, Hewson nicked himself during a dissection. The wound became septic and Hewson died. William Hewson was buried with dignity at St. Martin's in the Fields, but the dozens of bodies used in his anatomy lectures were buried in the yard. Human and animal remains commingled with chemical leftovers from anatomical demonstrations and experiments. Later, the yard became part of a basement, and 200 years later, they were found. It wasn't a grave, but a trash heap. So how does a person become trash? How does the physical body of a person become an object? A person is made into an object. They are objectified when their personhood, their perspective, their aims are irrelevant. At his death, William Hewson maintained the status of personhood. His remains were interred in a manner consistent with his faith, and while his widow and children remained in London, they would have been able to visit his burial site as part of their mourning. The people he dissected lost the status of personhood and were imbued with the alternate status of scientific object. Their names were not recorded. Their bones were not buried in recognition of their faith. Their families had no sites to visit. What those people would have wanted for their bodies after death was not a concern. In some ways, scientific objectification applied to every body. One of the core transformations of the Enlightenment was the replacement of an essentially spiritual understanding of the body with a new mechanical conception of the body as a machine. The arm is a lever, the tendons are pulleys, the human brain can run doom. This shift led to a greater tolerance for anatomical dissection within Enlightenment thinking, but popular conceptions of the body were still often imbued with spiritual significance. When Enlightenment thinkers wanted to dissect bodies, they weren't dissecting the bodies of their peers. Hewson's students and colleagues didn't respond to his death by saying, "Ooh, free cadaver." The bodies they used were sourced from segments of the society where people already lacked access to the kinds of dignity that they and Hewson enjoyed. I mentioned earlier that there weren't a lot of legal avenues for sourcing bodies, but in Franklin's time, some major universities like Oxford could rely on cadavers produced by state execution. Starting in 1752, anyone convicted of murder in London could be executed by hanging and then sent to Oxford for public dissection. Both the violation of the corpse through its use as a scientific object and the display of this violation were part of the punishment in addition to their utility to lecturers. But Oxford needed more corpses than London's murderers could provide, So the law expanded the territory whose convicts would be sent to Oxford for dissection. And this was still not enough. So the courts did the obvious, rational, and humane thing and made 200 additional crimes hanging offenses. Though the state was happy to strip away the humanity of convicted and executed Londoners, many still had families and friends who wanted to give them proper burials. Fights and even riots broke out as people struggled to de-arrest a beloved corpse and prevent it from being displayed as an object by the state. Silvia Federici wrote that people who faced hanging would spend their last days rallying loved ones to fight for their bodies so that they would not go to the surgeons.
This battle, significantly occurring at the foot of the gallows, demonstrates both the violence that presided over the scientific rationalization of the world and the clash of two opposite concepts of the body, two opposite investments in it. On one side, we have a concept of the body that sees it as endowed with powers even after death. The corpse does not inspire repulsion and is not treated as something rotten or irreducibly alien. On the other, the body is seen as dead even while still alive, insofar as it is conceived as a mechanical device to be taken apart just like any machine.
Sometimes a desperately poor family would sell remains themselves, but more often remains were directed from institutional sources, like executioners, charity hospitals, and workhouses. And still, the demand for corpses exceeded supply. England was engaged in fast-moving colonial expansion, leading to wars on many fronts and armies that needed qualified surgeons and physicians. The demand for medical training was skyrocketing, and so was the demand for objectified remains. Anatomy schools frequently sourced bodies from resurrectionists, which sounds like a metal band, but is actually a term for professional body snatchers. The practice and the public horror about it gave rise to defensive measures to protect graves from disruption, including posting guards at burial sites or using locked vaults or mort safes, which are giant metal cages or heavy, solid infrastructure to keep out resurrectionists and surround coffins. Side note, mort safes look extremely cool. They are also extremely expensive, so poorer families might use cheaper methods to detect disruption, such as planting a flower on the grave or stacking up small stones. This meant that the graves of poorer people in England became easier targets for body snatchers. There was so much public outcry about body snatching and occasionally murders for anatomists that in 1832, England passed the Anatomy Act, which revoked the automatic dissection of executed people and created a legal process for the donation of unclaimed bodies and introduced voluntary donation by the deceased or their next of kin. It's not a coincidence that the bodies that were transformed into scientific objects in Enlightenment London were overwhelmingly poor and criminalized people. In the latter part of the 18th century, the concept of population emerges as a major feature of European thought. Within a cultural context of fast expanding empires and the forcible movement of big groups from one part of an empire to another, called repopulation, through practices such as criminal deportation and racial enslavement, colonial leaders started thinking about population as a resource. In the best case, a desirable population would support the power and success of the state, but population could also be undesirable. Early writers such as Franklin were concerned about crowding, poverty, criminality, disability, and racialized others that would undermine progress toward what they viewed as the idealized state. In the last part of the 1790s, Thomas Malthus would publish an essay on the principle of population that offered the first distillation of population theory, but earlier 18th century thinkers like Ben Franklin exhibited similar thinking about the emerging framework of bodies as state resources. Prior to the Revolutionary War, Ben Franklin had encouraged England to manage its population through resettlement, sending unwanted citizens to the colonies because, from the perspective of colonial administrators like him, more bodies meant more pressure on colonial borders. At the same time, he worried about increasing black populations in the Americas, and he advocated for the elimination of Native American populations in favor of Europeans. So there's a tension between Enlightenment ideas of freedom and individuality and the reality of objectification through slavery, criminalization, genocide, and the treatment of human bodies as trade goods, scientific materials, and ultimately trash. To take a living person, kill them, and then dismantle their body in public view was deeply offensive to the faith and dignity of urban workers. And ultimately, England would pass laws limiting body collecting. These laws did not, however, apply to its colonies, and colonies often didn't have equivalent laws for the same reason that England hadn't previously. The idea of stealing a body out of a grave in order to take it apart was sufficiently taboo that that kind of law just wouldn't be needed. Mass grave robbing wasn't a thing until the settlers arrived. So European imperial rule into Africa, Asia, and the Americas permitted both the mass disruption of living populations and of graves. And again, that anti-grave robbing legislation in centers of imperial power didn't protect colonized peoples. Like a lot of physicians of his time, Benjamin Franklin didn't actually have any formal medical or scientific training. Even though he founded the first medical school in the United States, he himself had a very limited formal education. When physicians and scientists of the 18th and into the 19th century did have formal education, it was often as ministers. Charles Darwin was recruited for his world-changing expedition on the Beagle right out of seminary. Gregor Mendel performed his famous experiments on pea plants at his monastery, and Isaac Newton also attended seminary and only barely escaped ordination. Benjamin Franklin, though not an ordained minister, was embedded in a scientific world that was deeply connected to Protestant theology, and many of his biggest influences in scientific theory were also, or primarily, clergy. When Benjamin Franklin moved from London to Philadelphia in 1775, medicine in Europe was becoming increasingly professionalized, with more and more physicians attending medical schools, but that lagged in the colonies, where formal European-style schooling was just being organized for the first time. There, medicine was frequently a facet of pastoral care. Clergy would minister to the sick, both body and soul, and took this part of their job very seriously, often engaging in professional debates and contributing new ideas to medical journals. Medicine was also performed by uneducated and semi-educated practitioners. Today, certain job titles, including many clinical roles, are legally protected, meaning that it's illegal to call yourself, for instance, a medical doctor, without first going through a specific program of accredited training and licensing and maintaining professional registration. While today, physician, pharmacist, and surgeon all fall under this kind of professional regulation, in the 18th century, in the United States, basically anyone could set up shop. The Philadelphia Academy and Charity School that Franklin had founded would open the first medical school in the Americas in 1765. The school offered a Bachelor of Medicine and a Doctor of Medicine, intending the Bachelor of Medicine to be a preparatory course, what we would call pre-med. The student was supposed to complete a doctorate before entering independent practice, but the school graduated very few doctors in its early years, and the Bachelor of Medicine classes were often less than a dozen people. And most practitioners didn't even bother doing that. When the War of Independence began in 1775, only 5 to 10% of those practicing medicine in the British colonies in the Americas had college degrees. Medical teaching in the colonies, when it was happening at all, was largely happening through apprenticeships. In 1718, college-educated physician William Douglas commented,
"Physical practice in our colonies is so perniciously bad that excepting in surgery and some very acute cases, it is better to let nature take her course than to trust to the honesty and sagacity of the practitioner. He that sinneth before his Maker, let him fall to the hands of the physician. Frequently there is more danger from the physician than from the distemper, but sometimes, notwithstanding malpractice, nature gets the better of the doctor, and the patient recovers."
Medical care by a doctor was also prohibitively expensive for most people. In addition to organizing charity hospitals like the Pennsylvania Hospital, practitioners would publish self-help guides with advice for preventing and treating illness, knowing that many people couldn't afford to be patients. Before that long stretch in London, Franklin had published several self-help guides for health, including Every Man His Own Doctor, with the intensely salty description, "Designed for those who can't afford to die by the hand of a doctor," and sections of the better-known Poor Richard's Almanac. Ben Franklin's work was deeply tied to his theological commitments, especially an emphasis on service to others as a path to moral perfection. One of his biggest influences in this was Puritan minister Cotton Mather. Mather was a prolific writer who devoted his life to incorporating advances in scientific knowledge into Christian thought. He encouraged biblical analysis that supported heliocentrism, Newtonian physics, and atomic theory. Mather also contributed to European scientific thought the knowledge that flowering plants reproduce sexually, and he may have introduced the idea of genetic dominance, the idea that some heritable features are more likely to be expressed than others when mixed. He was also intensely influential in the Salem witch trials, preaching the importance of hunting witches and acting as an expert advisor to judges and magistrates involved in the trials because of his experience investigating demons. Ben Franklin was born 14 years after the Salem trial of Martha Corey, and one of the key witnesses in that case was his maternal aunt. The chronological space between Franklin and the Salem trials is about as wide as the space between me and Watergate, or the oldest Zoomers and Return of the Jedi, but the particular relation is much closer. The witch trials still had a lot of cultural meaning by Franklin's time, but it wasn't the same as it had been in his parents' age. By Franklin's time, a lot of Enlightenment thinkers, including Franklin himself, thought of the witch trials as a relic of a bygone era, an embarrassing holdout of the superstitious pre-Enlightenment time. But as Mather illustrates, a lot of the luminaries of early rationalism were deeply involved in the witch trials. And of course, it wasn't just Mather. Jean Bodin, Francis Bacon, and Isaac Newton wrote extensively about witchcraft. Thomas Hobbes was skeptical that witchcraft was real, but enthusiastically supported witch hunting anyway. By the late 18th century, Enlightenment thinkers like Franklin generally claimed that it was disorganized, uneducated, superstitious peasants who started the witch trials, and educated rationalists like them who ended them. Some historians, like Joseph Clates, have argued that this is basically how it happened. Increasing skepticism resulting from the scientific revolution gradually degraded belief in witchcraft, and that naturally led to the end of the witch trials. The problem with this theory is, as Clates has acknowledged, many of the people who were pivotal in ending the witch trials believed in witches. More problematic still, many of the people who supported them, like Hobbes, did not. Hobbes argued that a witch's intent to rebel against the state was reason enough to prosecute, even if her methods were doomed to fail. To weaken the superstitious peasants' argument even further, superstitious peasants kind of had to be convinced to panic about witches. It took a propaganda campaign. Other historians like Philippa Koch have argued that the idea of a sudden and complete shift from supernatural to scientific thinking, particularly about the body and health, is a 19th century projection. 19th century authors viewed 18th century religious thought as ignorant and passive, rejecting scientific engagement and agency in favor of passively waiting for God to intervene. There's an old joke about a faithful man who, stuck in a flood, turns away rescuer after rescuer, insisting that God would save him. Upon arriving in heaven, the man demands to know why he was abandoned, and God says, "I sent you 3 boats." This is about the view that 19th century historians have about 18th century Protestants. They view engagement with scientific investigation and technological development as necessarily opposed to a faith in God's concrete action on earth. But Koch says this doesn't hold up. Instead, she shows how religious and scientific thinkers like Mather worked hard to synthesize the emerging mechanical idea of the body with their profound faith in God's influence upon their lives. This synthesis influenced the language, metaphors, directions, and applications of emerging sciences of the 18th century, not least of which medical science, and the failure to acknowledge this influence in the 19th century has made it all but invisible to us in the 21st. So what ended the witch trials? Historians like Brian Easley and philosophers like Silvia Federici say that the trials ended when their goals were accomplished. Federici argues that by criminalizing European women's folk healing and African and indigenous healing and religious practices as witchcraft, expansionist European states were able to consolidate control and justify a dramatic restructuring of labor relations. Federici links the criminalization of abortion and folk healing and a manufactured public panic about demonic intervention with the transformation of reproduction from feminine mystery to state-controlled investment in the labor force. Via the witch trials, births and miscarriages became the subject of public record, and community-based healing, and especially the woman midwife, was replaced, violently, by an emerging professional class of physicians that structurally excluded almost all women and dramatically limited the participation of Black and Native men. At the same time, there's emerging rejection and criminalization of non-procreative sex, including anal sex, which appears in Italian Renaissance poetry as a popular contraception method, queer sexuality, which also, and any sexuality at all in postmenopausal women. This is deeply connected to the emerging idea of population. Armchair witchfinders Hobbes and Bowden were very concerned about population as a source of state power, and that may be part of why they supported the criminalization of abortion, sex work, and non-procreative sex. In the 18th century, race was an emerging social technology by which growing European powers negotiated a diplomatic alliance that allowed them to engage in pretty much unrestrained colonial expansion in Africa, Oceania, and the Americas, with relative stability within Europe itself. Sociologist Howard Winant and anthropologist Peter Wade date the emergence of the current world racial system around the time of the Reconquista, a period of repopulation in the Iberian Peninsula in which Christian kingdoms displaced and ultimately expelled Muslim and Jewish communities. The conflict was racialized by locating religious affiliation in blood and breast milk. While many Muslims and Jews were forced to convert to Christianity, there was suspicion towards converts, popularizing notions that being born a Muslim or a Jew marked a person with indelible difference from Christians. As European colonial expansion exploded, these ideas gave rise to debates about which human populations had truly human souls. Those that did, Europeans reasoned, could be meaningfully converted to Christianity, but those that didn't could be justifiably enslaved or exterminated. In the mid-16th century, humanist scholar Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda argued that the customs of indigenous peoples in the Americas, such as human sacrifice, proved that they did not possess basic humanity, and that their crimes against nature justified any type of intervention, including war or, conveniently, enslavement. The Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas rejected this, arguing that indigenous people are as human as European Christians and could not be treated as less than human, at least not once they had been trained to abandon their evil ways. As a compromise, however, he opined that Africans do not have human souls and may thus be properly used in whatever way is convenient. Over the 2 centuries between the establishment of the Spanish nation-state through the Reconquista and the establishment of the United States, the concept of race had developed further and shifted from a primarily theological to an increasingly scientific idea. The particular categories of superiority and inferiority, the boundaries between them, the logics, the evidence that they used to support these ideas shifted dramatically over these 2 centuries. But across their various details, rationales of race as a hierarchy of value, talent, and humanity gave the people who conceptualized themselves as the top of that hierarchy, by the late 18th century as white, justifications for having conflicting sets of moral duties when interacting with people of their own race versus with racialized others. Writing in the late 19th century, sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois would call this the color line and describe it as the central problem of the modern world. Franklin was no exception to the mode of thinking that dominated his time. In the last 3 years of his life, he turned his extensive talents for propagandism and printing toward promoting the abolition of slavery, but he had previously been a strong believer in inherent racial differences between white and black people, and had warned repeatedly about the increase of black population on the continent. And he also advanced deadly anti-native stereotypes. In November 1747, Franklin published Plain Truth, a pamphlet that famously included this political cartoon. Plain Truth encouraged colonists to imagine themselves as surrounded by deadly enemies, France, Spain, and the indigenous peoples of the area. In fact, peace with France and Spain was almost assured by the time of the pamphlet's publication, and frontier hostilities resulted from continued colonial expansion. A decade previously, Pennsylvania had claimed a huge territory in what is called the walking purchase, in which a bad faith deal allowed settlers to claim far more land than was intended by the sellers, and pushed Lenape people out of land that had sustained them. As settlers pushed the bounds of even this bad deal, struggles broke out. Still, Franklin's campaign was successful. Pennsylvania established a military force, and the pamphlet helped stoke public fears about native violence. Just as the non-working poor were excess to the needs of England, natives were excess to the needs of settlers. Optimizing the population in England looked like exporting people to the colonies, and optimizing population for Franklin looked like displacing and destroying native populations as more and more land came under European and then U.S. control. In the years that followed the walking purchase and plain truth, both encroachment and resistance continued. In 1756, Pennsylvania passed the Scalp Act, which offered payment for proof in the form of scalps of the killing of native people. 3 prices were set, one for men over 12, one for women over 12, and one for children. Scalp bounties were instituted in several colonies and widely accepted among settlers, with scalp bounties instituted in both English and French colonies. These bounties encouraged categorical targeting of native people by settlers. It also normalized a distinct form of body collecting and pathways of trading human remains within U.S. military and government. The colony's primary mechanism for objectifying human bodies was increasingly race, and the patterns of body collecting in the 19th and 18th centuries reflect this. Propaganda like Plain Truth helped build the racial trope of the savage as diametrically opposed to what the settlers viewed as civilization, just as Franklin's writings helped shape European ideas about blackness when he defended laws relating to the governing of enslaved people by explaining that black people are
a plotting disposition, dark, sullen, malicious, revengeful, and cruel in the highest degree.
During the Revolutionary War, Franklin published a fraudulent account of Seneca chiefs delivering almost 1,000 scalps of murdered colonists to King George. While settlers were broadly accepting of scalp bounties, Franklin knew that metropolitan European readers would be horrified by the practice, and Franklin hoped that this fraudulent report would damage popular support for the war in England. The same week that Franklin published that fictitious account, the Pennsylvania militia that he founded had executed a horrific massacre of a pacifist Moravian village, killing and scalping nearly 100 people and systematically raping the women and girls. 2 children escaped the attack, one of whom had been scalped alive. And this was not a unique occurrence. Between the publication of Plain Truth and the publication of the fraudulent story of the Seneca attack, Pennsylvania had seen repeated atrocities, frequently by the militia, but occasionally by groups of civilians. And Franklin certainly knew about this, as he was centrally involved in investigating one such attack while he was a member of the militia he founded. Franklin's hoax was published in England as true, and then papers in the Americas picked up the story. It took 70 years before the hoax was recognized, and even now, historians in the U.S. often describe it in uncomplicatedly admiring terms, never connecting it to anti-native massacres that Franklin's writing both justified and funded. When Franklin died, philosopher William Smith eulogized him as striving for an era of civilized humanity and a United States that would have neither slave nor savage within the whole regions of America. Smith's address was delivered at the request of the American Philosophical Society. It was attended by President George Washington, members of Congress, and Philadelphia luminaries. This vision of a white America cannot be separated from Franklin's role in shaping many of the basic institutions of American society, because it wasn't separate for Franklin, nor was it separate for the institutions he founded. Smith, who praised Franklin's vision for a white America, was the first provost of the University of Pennsylvania, where he also served as a professor of ethics. At the centennial anniversary of medical instruction at the University of Pennsylvania, university faculty compiled a history of the department. That history opens with the following sentiment.
The most enlightened nations of all periods have perceived the advantages and zealously promoted the formation of colonial settlements.
The introduction continues by positioning the race of Teutons as the most successful of all empire builders and connecting white Americans with the Roman Empire, concluding that
we are in this land today the representatives of a civilization which has never lost a foot of soil to which it has been transplanted, nor yielded by force of arms to any rival or competitor for supremacy.
in setting out to explain their program's history, the Faculty of Medicine started with an articulation of racial colonialism as the foundation of their work. When we ask questions like, was Benjamin Franklin a serial killer? We aren't really interested in the bodies in the basement. We're asking how we should morally judge Benjamin Franklin. 19th century history overemphasized the role of individual people, the idea of men of genius who shaped history with their own hands. The history of Penn Medicine that I mentioned contains numerous vignettes of individual alumni and faculty making explicit arguments for how the reader should judge their character. The purpose in considering their actions was expressly to judge them as morally good, and as a result, to conclude that the university that educated them is also morally good. In emphasizing this good or bad question about Ben Franklin, everyone else in the story disappears. No, Benjamin Franklin didn't kill the people found in his London basement. But he did have a big role in developing social structures and professional practices that shaped the lives and afterlives of people like them. In the 18th century, and since then, academic and clinical medicine were deeply involved in the development and centralization of race as a scientific framework. High-risk medical studies and experiments would privilege racially devalued subjects in order to protect white people from risk, even as studies generally treated white bodies as the default, neglecting to study those groups researchers considered inferior, irrelevant, or not worth investing in. Clinically, professional care in the colonial U.S. was most available to wealthier settler men who could afford to hire European-trained doctors to travel to their homes, even at a great distance from city centers, in order to provide care for them or household members as they decided. That could be wives, children, elder family members, and household laborers, including free, indentured, or enslaved workers. Because the wealthy settler man was the client in all of these cases, the decision to invest in care often reflected the value he got out of the relationship, and he would make decisions regarding what services were purchased, regardless of the will of the patient. This meant, for instance, that professional obstetricians were more likely to privilege the life of a newborn over the life of a birthing person, and the transition from midwives to male obstetricians came with a rise in maternal deaths. This also meant that certain types of injuries, such as those associated with violence against enslaved people, were unlikely to be treated professionally. The shift toward professional medicine also gave rise to urban medical centers. Settlers living in poverty within major cities might be able to seek out care at charity hospitals, but those living on the frontiers and in rural areas, like non-white city dwellers, were largely on their own. Prior to the criminalization of traditional healing and colonial displacement, it wouldn't be as much of a problem. If you think about your own first response when you feel sick, it probably isn't to go straight to your GP, but to treat your symptoms at home using primarily non-pharmaceutical interventions that you learned from your parents. Mom's chicken soup is traditional healing. Early in the colonization of the Americas, settlers eagerly learned from local healers and adopted many of the medicines they learned of. But as race increasingly structured European thinking, it became more difficult for white scientists to recognize the value in culturally exterior innovations. For example, inoculation was widely practiced in Africa as well as across many parts of Eastern and Southern Asia, but Europeans were highly resistant to the practice. When Cotton Mather learned of inoculation from Onesimus, a West African person he enslaved, Mather encouraged inoculation as a solution to the 1721 smallpox epidemic in Boston. His house was bombed. In areas hit less hard by witch trials, rural peasants, including in Europe, retained traditional practices using local herbs and first aid practices, and some of those traditional practices survive even today. But the displacements of colonization disrupted land relations, and the witch trials suppressed the diffusion of knowledge between indigenous, African, and settler communities. This suppression pushed traditional practices underground and left settlers less reliable information to draw from. Sometimes newcomers to North America took best guesses on plants that sort of resembled what they'd seen back home, and sometimes that could lead to serious poisoning. settlers increasingly gave up on traditional healing and relied more and more on professional medicine as sources of both treatment and knowledge about home care. For those who could not independently access professional resources, however, there was more need to overcome the disruptions of colonial repopulation and forge new local knowledge. Enslaved communities developed knowledge of their now local herbal medicine and shared practices rooted in African traditional medicine such as midwifery and knowledge of inoculation. The intellectual practices developed within the explicit racial framework of early professional medicine still shape academic medicine. During the coronavirus pandemic, medical scholars in Africa have criticized scholars and policymakers in the global north for refusing to learn from their successes. The United States has reported over 90 million cases of COVID-19, compared with less than 12 million across the whole continent of Africa. The US has had more than 4 times as many COVID-related deaths, even though Africa is a continent of 1.2 billion people and the US has only 300 million. Africa's success in managing the pandemic came out of a fast, coordinated response between the 47 affected countries, but English language writing on the African response tends to either emphasize challenges in the response process or to present African success as a matter of complete luck. What would the coronavirus pandemic have looked like in the United States if we had been willing to learn from Africa's expert leadership from the start? What would the next year look like if we started now? Thank you so much for joining me for the first episode of Remains to be Seen, and thank you as well to the generous patrons who have patiently supported me during the very boring pre-publication part of this project. If you'd like to support my work financially and see your name in the credits of the next installment, you can subscribe at patreon.com/HanKaylee. As of the writing of this script, my YouTube channel has 16 followers, so it would also help me immensely if you would like, comment, subscribe, and share this video with absolutely anyone you think might find it interesting. In my next video, I'm visiting Baltimore's National Museum of Health and Medicine, where I'll be exploring the question, why does the Department of Defense have such a big collection of human remains?